Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Mem Zayin. We're going to get started with a quick review of some of the questions we asked yesterday. We started from the very, very bottom of Mem Vav Amud Aleph, and we asked, Rami Bar Chama asked, if you bow down to a mountain, can you use those stones in the altar? Okay, even though the mountain's not forbidden, but the question is, and the stones might not be forbidden because they came from something attached to the ground, the stones aren't forbidden, but can they be used for something sacred, like the altar? And then we said, making the altar is only machshir korban, not the korban itself. Then we ended up answering that question. Rava answered from the Kal Vachomer that it would be forbidden, actually. And then we questioned that Kal Vachomer, could you knock it out? But in the end we said you can't really knock it out because that's a knockout l'kula, not l'chumra. Then Rami Bar Chama at the bottom of the daf asked whether you bow down to a stack of, if somebody bows down to grains, to chitim, to wheat, and then they turn it into flour and use it for a mincha offering. Is that okay? Because there's a shinoi. It changes. Once it changes, maybe the nevad status, the fact that it was worshipped, maybe goes out the window. So Mar Zutra had answered and said, let's learn it from here. Everything that's asher l'gabei mizbach, their offspring is permitted, and that's a shinoi basically. Rabbi Eliezer forbade. So look, it's a machloket tanaim. But now we're going to reject this. And then we're going to have a whole different version of this back and forth. So we rejected by saying, V'lav it mar'ala, 2 lines from the bottom of Mem Vav Amud Bet. Isn't it said about that, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua, machloket kashenirbu levasof ibru. Their machloket is all based on, and I'll go with Rashi's wording, that it's all based on this machloket about zev zeh golim. Meaning, when the fetus is created from a male and a female, and the male and the female was already near Ba'ah. Okay, here they're taking, by the way, kol asurim l'gabei mizbech would include an animal that engaged in bestiality. It would also include an animal that was worshipped, that idol worship happened. But now we're using the example of bestiality. If the mother had been engaged in bestiality previously, and then levasof ibru, but after that got pregnant, then there's 2 factors that contribute. One is mutter, one is asr. The male is not forbidden. The female is forbidden. So if you say zev zeh goreim is mutter, then you'll say this is mutter. If you say it's asr, this will be asr. But that doesn't have to do with our machloket. But ibru ulevasof nirbu. But if it first got pregnant and then was nirbu, then divrei kol asurim, then everybody would forbid it because the fetus was already in utero when the mother engaged in bestiality, and therefore that would be considered forbidden for the altar, according to all the opinions. And then the answer would be, it would be forbidden, because haninami ki'ibru levasof nirbu udami. Our case is just like that, really. Now, it's obviously a different case, and it's not a nubar, but shinoi by birth and shinoi by grinding, either which way, it's going to be forbidden. But second version of this actually isn't going to get to an answer at all. According to the second version, Ikad Amrei, now it starts up the same way. Mar Zutra says, let's learn from here. Kol asurim l'gabei mizbech v'lo dehem mutarim. Rabbi Eliezer says asurim, but he continues, and it's not that we reject his suggestion and give a different one, but he himself says, machloket b'shenirbu levasof ibru. And if you look in the Bach says it should say v'it mar'ala. And it was said about this. In other words, this is all part of his explanation. And he says, and it was said about this, that the machloket is kashenir bu levasof ibru. Now the content's the same. The machloket is all about the zev zeh gorim issue. Aval ibru levasof nirbu divrei kol aser. And then he himself makes the comparison and says v'haninami ki ibru levasof nirbu udami. In which case he gets the answer: it's forbidden. Okay, so in the previous version he wanted to say it was a machloket tanaim, which means depending on who you hold by. And then the Gemara rejected it and said, no, it's clear actually. Everyone agrees it's aser. Now, in this case, we make the comparison. He makes the comparison himself and says, from here you see it's asr, because that's not the machloket. The machloket is about zev zeh gorim. Everyone would agree if there was a shinoi done, like birth or grinding, it would still be forbidden. But now the Gemara rejects this comparison. Hachi hashta, hatami ikar behema, v'hashta behema. You can't compare the change made by an animal being born and wheat being ground to flour. That's just like a door opening. The fetus comes out, it just, it's born. That's not a change. It just comes out of a door. Okay, as if it was that simple, but okay. But this changed completely change its form as well, right? The form of the fetus didn't change, even though you could say there's kind of a change there, but okay. But the form didn't change from wheat to flour, and therefore you can't compare them. In which case, it seems like we don't really have an answer. By Rish Lakish, now we get to another question. Rish Lakish's question. So we had two by Rami bar Chama about neva b'mechubar etzel gavoa or not, right? Can you use it for gavoa or not? A neva that was attached. And then we have Rami bar Chama who says, if you bow down to wheat and you turn into flour, is that going to change it? By Rish Lakish, Hamishtachavela dekel lulavo mahu lemitzvah. If you bow down to a palm tree and then you want to use its lulav for a mitzvah, are you allowed to? So now we're going to have two possibilities about what his question is. If it was originally planted for idol worship, of course we're not asking that question. Clearly it will be forbidden. That would be complete avodah zarah, no benefit at all. Forget about using for a mitzvah. The question is, it's a tree that was planted first to be a regular palm tree, and then later you decided to worship it. Now, even within that, seems like the sugya we learned previously, now, if you had an ilan that you planted and then ultimately worshipped, we learned already, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, that's going to be forbidden. So obviously this would be forbidden to be used as a mitzvah if it's forbidden to benefit from. Okay, so now we're saying according to the rabbis, who the rabbi said this is mechubar, it's not forbidden to benefit from, but can you cut a lulav branch from there and use it for your lulav? That's the question. Mima is klape gavoa olo. Is this already considered despised before God or not? And can it be used for a mitzvah? That's one possibility, and they don't even try to answer this question. Okay, there's no answer. Second possibility, ki ata Rav Dimi amar, when Rav Dimi came, he said, ba'ashera shebit laka mebayile. It's a totally different question. It's about an eitz asherah that was worshipped. But the Gentile who worshipped this idol decided not to use it anymore as an eitz asherah and nullified it. Now, can we now take a lulav branch? No, it's not avodah zarah anymore, so it won't be forbidden to benefit from. The question is, can you use it for a mitzvah? Do we say yesh dichuy etzel mitzvot or ein dichuy etzel mitzvot? Do you say once something's rejected from being a mitzvah, it's rejected? Now again, we're making this comparison between sanctified items and mitzvot, because on the altar, if you have an animal that was disqualified, you can't bring that animal anymore. Once it's rejected, it's rejected. But is it the same for mitzvah? Because mitzvot aren't exactly the same as sacrifices. So the Gemara says, why are you even asking this question? Shouldn't it be obvious how we answer it? Tivshole miditnan, you should be able to answer it for the following Mishnah. And then why would he be asking the question if it's a clear Mishnah? Kisahu, okay, this is the mitzvah of kisui hadam. You have to cover the blood after you slaughter an animal. Kisahu v'nitgaleh patur milachasot. If you cover the blood and then the dirt blew off and it's no longer covered, you're exempt already because you did the mitzvah. Kisau haruach, but if the wind covered it and then blew it off again, chayav l'chasot, because you never actually fulfilled the mitzvah. Now, if it covered it, you wouldn't have to do anything about it. But if it got uncovered, then you would have to actually redo the mitzvah because you never really did the mitzvah in the first place. It just kind of happened by the wind. So I already told you this, which is he says, Kisau haruach chayav l'chasot. You might have thought that meant if the wind covers it, you still have to cover it. But no, it means exactly as I said it. You covered it, it got uncovered, and then you covered it again. But if it didn't get uncovered, then you're fine, because the mitzvah was fulfilled even though you didn't fulfill the mitzvah. Now comes the question. They asked, but wait, if it got revealed after it was covered and now it's uncovered, why should it matter? The mitzvah was already rejected, meaning you already, once it was covered, the mitzvah was fulfilled, because if it had stayed that way, it would have been fine, which means your opportunity to do the mitzvah was pushed off already. And Rav Papa said there, this teaches us there is no such thing as dichoy by mitzvah, because if there was dichoy by mitzvah, that this mitzvah could have been pushed off because the wind covered it, then you would have thought, okay, so now I can't do the mitzvah anymore. And then there wouldn't even be a question, right? So, and why do you have to recover it? The mitzvah was already rejected because you didn't need you didn't need to do it anymore. So now we're going to say, right, you wouldn't be obligated a second time because the mitzvah is completely, your opportunity. Let's put it this way. Your opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah was pushed off because it was covered, and then you couldn't do the mitzvah anymore. So that would be saying yesh dichoyetz mitzvah. But we don't say that because once it gets uncovered again, you actually have to cover it and fulfill the mitzvah. The mitzvah wasn't pushed off. So he infers from here there's no dichoyetz mitzvah. So the question is, then we already have our answer. There is no such concept of dichoyetz mitzvah. Now we're going to see in a minute these are a little bit different, but now we're going to explain how we can explain the question according to this. Rav Papa Gufa Ibayale. What he really wanted to ask was specifically about, he knew Rav Papa's answer, and about that he wanted to ask. Mifsha pshita le Rav Papa de'ein dichoyetz mitzvot, loshna lekula veloshna lechumra. Do we say, is it obvious to Rav Papa that there's no dichoy, whether it's the kula, whether it's the chumra? Now let's think about it. By the mitzvah of kisoy hadam, we're going to say, ein dichoy is lechumra. The mitzvah is not pushed off. You have to fulfill the mitzvah. But would he say the same thing, lekula? Okay? Lo shana lekula, lo shana lechumra. O dilma sipuke mesavkele. U lechumra amrinan, lekula lo amrinan. Maybe we only say lechumra in the kisoy dam case. But in our case with the lulav, it would be a kula. Because we would say if there's no dichoy, that means that the mitzvah is not pushed off. Which means I could do the mitzvah with this lulav once the Gentile canceled it from being idol, an idol worship item. So that's the question. So we still would have a question according to Rav Papa, and therefore it's not a difficulty with this possibility that this is the question. And what's the answer? Teku. We don't have an answer. Okay, so we didn't have an answer for most of these questions that we asked. Okay, we had an answer for the first question of Rami Bar Chama about Yesh Ne'avad Etzel Gavoa, and we said it's yes, Ne'avad meaning it's forbidden. Then, right, Mechubar, we then had, if you bow down to the wheat, we have one possible answer that it's forbidden. In the second version of the answer, we said we don't have an answer. And then we had two possible questions of Rish Lakish, and we really don't have an answer for either one of them. By Rav Papa, another question. If you bow down to an animal, can you use the wool for tchelet? Okay, again, we have a mitzvah here we want to use for tchelet. And can you use the wool? So they want to know what kind of mitzvah we're talking about here. Tchelet demai. Eat chelet lekohanim, if it's for the kohanim that they need it for big day kahuna. Without big day kahuna, without their clothing, some of the clothing have wool that was made of chelet. Without that, they can't do the korban. So that's what we call machshirei korban. So that's already hainu ba'ed Rami Bar Chama. That's the question of Rami Bar Chama at the top of Memvav Amud Bet. That's why I keep going back to it. Right? Is there, right? Can we use something that was nevad? That can you use that was nebat from an animal, which normally the animal's not forbidden, but it's talush, and now it's talush, but it was originally mechubar. Can you use it for a machshir korban? Itchelet litzitzit hainu by the Rish Lakish. It's just a regular mitzvah. Well, that's Rish Lakish of the lulav question. By the way, some people think it's also the second question for Rami Bar Chama, which is it also relates to the chitin, because there we did a shinoi. Here also you're doing a shinoi, you're turning it into threads. Okay, so that's also has to do with both questions of Rami Bar Chama, really. And if it's tzitzit, that's the question of Rish Lakish. So what's he asking? So they say, inachinami, the truth is, he really didn't need to ask this question. We could just refer back to the previous questions. Now, in the end, we don't have answers to them, but the point is, why would he need to make up a question that was already asked, and we didn't have a clear answer? But he actually wanted to ask a different question and started with this to get to the second question. Tzamar ma'u l'tchelet was how he started. Can you use the wool for tchelet? Karneha, what about the horns? Can you use them? Ma'u l'chatzotzrot. Shokeha ma'u l'chalilim. Can you use the calves for, meaning the bones really, to make a chalil out of it? Now, what do we need the chatzotzrot and the chalilim? And we're going to see the other things. We're using them for musical instruments for the Leviim to sing their songs in the temple. We're going to see in a minute what the question is really. B'nei me'eha, if you use their innards, mahu lepoarot. Okay, poarot, they say, are the strings for the harp. Aliba demanda amar ikar shira b'kalilo tibaylach. If you hold that the main way the Levites do the singing is with musical instruments. And if you don't use the instruments, they haven't done the shir. Now the shir is part of the korban. You have to do the shir in order for the korban. Then it goes back to just machshirei korban. Tivadai asir, for sure it's forbidden, because that goes back to the question about the korban, and we said all those things that are mechubar, or like animals, right, taken from animals, they're going to be forbidden. But those who say the main singing that they do is with their voices, the musical instruments are just accompaniment. They're not part of the essential part of the mitzvah. Bisume kalava almahu umaitinan, is it just to make the voice sound nicer, and therefore you can bring it from these other things, from the animal that was used as idol worship? O dilma filuhachi aser, or perhaps it's going to be forbidden anyway, okay? Because it still has to do with something in the temple, and perhaps it would be forbidden anyway. And again, Teku, we're left with no answer. This is a big machloket that comes up in different places. Is ikar shira b'kli or not? Okay, is it the voices or is it the musical instruments? That's the main musical element that's necessary for the Levites. By Rabbah, another question. If you bow down to a stream, a spring, or some sort of stream, can you use the water for the libations? Now here we're going to have to say also what makes this question different from the other cases. So maybe the question is, were you bowing to your own reflection, or were you bowing to the water? Now, if it's just the reflection, then the water is not forbidden. If it's the water itself, then the water is forbidden. Well, if that's the case, you should just ask a question. If a person bows down to a water in a cup, are they bowing down to the reflection of the water in the cup, or are they bowing down to themselves? So that you don't need to ask it about specifically a mitzvah for the libations on the altar. You could just ask it about, is it just forbidden for avodah zarah purposes? Lo olam lemaya kasagi. No. Clearly, we're talking about that you're worshiping the water, and the question is this: Hachi kame baile. This is the question: Lemaya dekame kasagid v'kama kama asdu. Are you bowing down to the water that's in front of you? And since it's a stream and it's moving, the water keeps moving. So you bow down to the water that's right in front of you, but a second later the water moved on, and therefore the water that's in front of you now is permitted. O dilma lidabruna demaya kasagid, or are you bowing down to the stream of water? And then you're basically forbidding all of the water in the stream, and then you wouldn't obviously be able to use that for the libations. So now they say, wait a minute, you're by a public stream, and you bow down. You forbid all the waters in the stream. How could that be? You can't forbid public waters. They don't belong to you. So, we're talking about actually that they were water in a spring or a stream that's in your property. It stays in your property completely and you own it. And then the question is, did you forbid the whole thing, or and then, once the water streams over to a different place, that's not forbidden anymore? Or is it all the waters, and then it would be all the waters in your property would be forbidden? Okay, new Mishnah. We're going to have a lot of Mishnayot today. Mishaya beito, samuch lavodah zarah. I had a house, and then Beit Avodah Zarah moved in next door, and they built a house around, but kept my wall as the wall of their, because the wall was already up. They built right next to it using my wall. So now, if it falls, that wall, v'nafal, asur livnoto. This sounds a lot like the beginning of Bava Batra with neighbors and walls and all that, shared space. So I can't rebuild the wall because I'm basically building a wall now for the idol-worshipping temple. Ketzad Yasa, so what can I do? I'm not going to not have a wall in my house. Kones b'toch shelo arba amot uboneh. I move 4 amot inside to my property, and I build a wall there so that it's clearly not going to be a wall on their property. We're going to talk about, but then you're basically moving your boundary in 4 amot, and they're benefiting the other 4 amot. We're going to get back to that. Okay, the Mishnah continues. Hayash shelo v'shel avodah zarah. What if we shared the wall? We built it together. They built one part, right? Half of it's mine, half of it's theirs, or it's kind of a shared wall that we built together. So nidon mechzal, mechzal turning out amubet. We treat it as 50-50. So what does that mean? It means that basically, when I have to move in 4 amot, I move in 4 amot from the middle of where that wall was. Because basically, right, if the wall falls down, I still have to move in 4 amot. But since the wall was jointly owned, it means the property line is right in the center there. So instead of moving 4 amot in from where, let's say, where the wall used to be, I only have to move 3 amot because one of those amot was mine already, and then the other one was on the other side. So basically, we're saying the border is right smack in the middle. Now, of this shared wall, since part of it was used for idol worship, and now we don't know which was mine and which was theirs, and Rashi points out here, right? Even my part, and it's going to fall now. It's going to fall on both of our properties. Now, if I pick up the stones that are on my side, if you remember from Baba Batra, they're now mine, but we can't say that now it's as if these were mine to begin with. No, it could be you have stones mixed in there, pretty likely. We don't use Brera here to say, oh, well, now that they're on my side, these are going to be mine, and retroactively it was as if they were mine. No. These were stones that were worshipped, and therefore, there's a Gzera D'Rabbanan that all stones, wood, dust, all that stuff, soil that was used for Avodah Zarah purposes here, mitamim kesheretz. It carries tuma of a sheretz, which means it's tamei if I touch it. And that I become tamei. Shenemal shaketz tishaktzenu, because by idol worship it says, now these are just asmachtot. This is all Gzera D'Rabbanan. It does not really learn out from the Torah, but the shaketz tishaktzenu, you should despise it, but it's like a sheretz, right? Because shretzim are also considered shkatzim, right? They're shekets. Rabbi Akiva Omer, kinida. It's actually worse than sheretz. It's more like a nida, which is not only matame maga, it's also matame masa. If I carry it, even if I don't touch it, I could have it on a tray and I don't touch it, but it'll be, since I carried it, I'll become tameh. Shenemar tazreim kemo dava. Okay, that's another pasuk which says, again, it's just an asmachta, scatter it like dava. Dava is another word for nida. Say, right, this is a woman who's menstruating. Say, tomar lo ma nida metama b'masa, af avodah zarah metama b'masa. So they say, we're going to learn avodah zarah is metame masa. Okay, now the Gemara starts and asks the question we said before. If you're going to move 4 amot into your space, hakam rivach lavodah zarah, you're basically aiding avodah zarah. You're giving them more property because you're putting up the wall 4 amot away from their property. So Amar Rav Chanina Misura da Avele Beit HaKisei. No, you put a bathroom there, okay, a space like an outhouse. V'habayit tzniuta. But wait, you now have this outhouse with no wall on the other side, and it's open into this temple of Avodah Zarah. How could you possibly do that? You have to go to the bathroom with, tzniut. It's modesty. So da Avele Beit HaKisei de Laila. You make an outhouse for use at night when it's dark and nobody will see. But wait, v'ha marmar, isn't it said, Ezehu tzanua, hanifneh b'layla, b'makom shenifneh b'yom? What does it mean to be tzanua? You go to the bathroom at night in the same place, or at least that's what we think right now, that you go b'makom, the same place you go during the day. Now, even though they said, okay, it doesn't really mean that. You don't have to go to the same outhouse. You can go to a different outhouse, but, a more exposed one. But go in the same manner. Okay, this is what we call... let me see if Rashi says it. I forget the exact wording, but like you remove a little and you put back a little, meaning you don't take off all your clothes, but you pick up a little, put down a little, you make sure that, you do it as sanua as possible, as modest as possible. So you do it like that. And therefore, okay, so even though it doesn't mean you can't use the same outhouse, still you need tzniut, and there's no wall here, it's totally exposed. So they say, you make a bathroom for children, and then the space is filled, but it's not an issue of tzniut, and it's still in your property and still being used by you. Or perhaps you border it with thorns and shrubs. Now, this could mean one of two things. Either you fill the space with thorns and shrubs just to make sure, like you are going to lose your space, but you just make sure that they don't use it, okay? And then you're not benefiting the idol worship temple. Or it could be you put up a border there, like a border that's not really enough for their house. You're not really benefiting them. But for you, it gives you some privacy so you can use that space for your own sake. Okay, new Mishnah. Shlosha batim heim. Okay, we're now going to have 2 more Mishnayot, which are similar. One is talking about houses and one is talking about stones. There's 3 types of houses, and we're going to see later in the Gemara, but I'll already tell you now because it'll be easier if we learn it like this from the beginning. It's going to be clear from the Gemara. The main subject here is how do you cancel something. Okay, now we're not talking about canceling idols. That's different. That only Gentiles can do. But in these kind of situations, we're going to have 3 types, and they each can either never be canceled or can be canceled in particular ways. So we're going to see. Shlosha batim heim. There's 3 categories of houses. There's bayit shebana'ot tchila lavodah zarah, harei ze asur. House that was built originally for idol worship is forbidden. Siyado v'chiyado lavodah zarah v'chidesh, no telma shechidesh. But if you had a house that was built already, not for idol worship purposes, then you plastered it for the sake of avodah zarah, okay, in order to worship there, or some people think you plastered avodah zarah on the walls or something, and you were worshiping the walls. Two different opinions. V'chidesh, meaning, and in that way you renewed your house. It's like doing a shiputz, a renovation. You've renovated for the purpose of the idol. Notel mashachidesh, you can take away the renovation, right, where you put on the wall the plastering, and then your house is no longer forbidden. If you brought in an idol into a regular, you had a house, you built, you didn't do anything for avodah zarah, but then you just brought in an idol and then took it out. That was just a temporary space where you used it for worship, idol worship. The whole house doesn't become forbidden. So those are the three categories, right? One can't be batel. The opposite, right? The other extreme doesn't even need bitul, and the middle one needs bitul, and that you do by undoing the plaster. The Gemara starts off, and Rav says the following: Halach Amar Rav, Hamishtachaver labayit asaro. If you bow down to a house, you forbid this house. Okay? Now, then the whole house is forbidden. So the first thing we're going to say is, let's explain this. Let's explain the reason for this. Alma kasaval, he must hold talushu levasov chibro ketalush dami. This goes back to the whole sugya about mechubar. A house is attached to the ground. But if I built it, a house, on the other hand, is on the one hand attached. On the other hand, it's taken from things that weren't attached to the ground, and then became attached to the ground. So since they were originally detached, and then you attach them to the ground, that actually is forbidden. Okay, that's what we see from here, because it's like talush. It's as if it was detached from the ground, because you see here that you can forbid a house, as opposed to a mountain, which you can't forbid, because that's mechubar. So now they have a question on Rav, though. V'hanam b'na'otan. Didn't it say if you built a house for avodah zarah it's forbidden? It didn't say if you bow down to a house. So it sounds like if you bow down to a house, it doesn't forbid it. So they say no, but now, afal pi shelo ishtachavalo, afal pi shelo b'na'o. There's two cases really. There's building it, even though you didn't bow down to it. That's the Mishnah. And then there's this additional case of Rav, which is you bow down even though you didn't build it. So the Gemara says, wait, yihachi anu shlosha arba'avu. Well then, there shouldn't be three cases, there should be four. There should have been listed in the Mishnah as well. But they say, as I mentioned before, kevan delinya bitul. The whole Mishnah was all about bitul. That was the topic of the Mishnah. The topic of the Mishnah was how do you nullify things? Well, for that, banavish tachava chad kachashible. They're one of the same category because both these things can never be nullified. So it didn't add it because it's really just the same as case one. Next Mishnah. Shlosha avanim heim. There's three types of stones. Evan shechatzava mitchila lebimus. You carved it out of the mountain. You quarried it specifically to make a platform to put an idol on. Harezo asura, that's forbidden forever, just like the house. Sida v'chida, you plastered it and etched images in it. By the way, I forgot to explain. Chida is etched images. You plastered it and then put images in it. L'shem avodah zarah, for the purposes of avodah zarah. No tel mashasiyeh v'chiyenu muteret. You take it off and it's permitted, just like the house. Mira le'avodah zarah v'silcha. If you put avodah zarah on the stone and then took it off, harez muteret, that was just temporary. You don't even need bitul. So Amar Rabbi Ami, v'hu shesiyeh v'kiyeh b'gufa shel even. This is only if you etched it into the stone itself. So they say, wait, but hadumiyah debayit snan ubayit la begufehu umitzar. Wait a minute. In the stone, it's only if you etch it into the stone. But in the house, it sounded like you just plaster the walls, not into the walls. So why would in the house it be forbidden even if it wasn't in the walls? And here it's only if it's in the stone. Well, bayit nami ikabene orbe. They say the house, when you plaster a house, by the way, you do put it in between the stones. So that is considered inside the house, like in it. Milo askinan, but they try to reject this and say, what do you mean? Can't you also be talking about the shia v'hadar shi'eh, where you plastered it and then you originally made a house, plastered it, and put everything in between all the stones, the cement and everything, and then you plastered it again over, like you did a new layer of plaster. Couldn't that be what the renovation is? And in which case it's not in the walls really. Okay, so ela ki itmar de Rabbi Ami l'inyam bitul itmar. What he was really talking about was how to nullify it. Meaning, even if you etch it, you plaster and etch into the stone itself, if you take it all out, it's fine. Now, why would you have thought it wouldn't be? We'll finish up with that. You might have thought that once you do it inside the stone, it's as if you quarried the stone for that purpose because it's so ingrained into the stone. And maybe you would have to have like a Gentile come and actually nullify it for it to be nullified. And it's not enough just to remove the plaster. But no, you can remove the forms, the plaster, everything you put on it, and it goes back to its original form, and that's how we resolve. Okay, so quick review of today. What did we do? We continue with all these different questions about what you can do with things that were worshipped, right? We had the one about the grains that turned into flour. We tried to come up with the answer. We have Rish Lakish, who said you bow down to the dekel, can use the lulav for the mitzvah. And we had 2 possible suggestions as to what the question was, right? Most of these were left unanswered. We have Rav Papa, if you bow down to an animal, can you use the wool for the tchelet, to which we said, wait, this doesn't really make sense. These are previous questions already. We said really what he wanted was for if you take other parts of the animal and use it for the musical instruments. Are the musical instruments essential? Are they considered part of the worship, or are they not really essential? And since they're not essential, right, they're not essential anyway, we're going to say, according to the one who says they're not essential, but maybe you can't use them anyway, or maybe you can, and that also was left unanswered. And we had the question about the water itself. We had to figure out what exactly the question was, and from there we moved to this issue of the shared wall, and how we handle that if it falls down, and how also it's tame, what comes out of there is matame b'mag, or maybe b'masa also, depending on the 2 different opinions. And then from there we got to these 3 ways of nullifying, right, three gradations of houses and stones, and how you can nullify if you created them for idol worship or use them for idol worship. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.